Hi there, my name is Ian Gotts. I'm the CEO of Elements.cloud. I'd like to spend some time talking to you about the importance of managing requirements, how uncontrolled requirements can run you ragged. This is another of the Trailhead Live sessions and a number of that I'm running around the whole importance of business analysis. So as a little bit of background, I've been in the Salesforce ecosystem since 2001. And in all of that time, I've been involved in business process requirements, business process analysis. And before that, I was an Accenture consultant for 12 years, again, thinking about systems implementation. So I'm passionate about helping people understand how to do a better job of business analysis so it will help their implementations. And I know that many people struggle to justify why they should be spending time on analysis when the pressure is just to get on and start building. And often I like to go back and look at, say, the All Confessions, because I think there's some great examples there that illustrate why it's such a challenge. So for this particular session, I pulled out All Confessions 751. So I don't know who wrote those, they're anonymous, but the quote here is, spent 3 hours putting a change into production after weeks of designing and testing. By the end of the day, we had to turn the process off as the whole sales team were up in arms about a process they'd never been consulted on. So there's a clear example of a lack of user engagement up front, which has turned to poor adoption, or in fact a release which had to be recalled. So for the whole of this, I'd like to talk about adoption and analysis in the context of the implementation lifecycle. So you can see here we've got 4 phases: analyze, build, deliver, and operate. And every change will go through this cycle. And obviously big changes will take more time to go around the cycle, but even if it's a small change, that small change should go through every single step. So if I think about analyze, we're talking about capturing requirements, mapping processes, doing org analysis, and then writing user stories. And that's really where I'm going to spend a little bit of time today thinking about that phase, analyze. Obviously, those user stories then feed into the build phase, where we configure code, we document the changes we've made, and we test them. So we're then ready to deploy them. So we back up the metadata, deploy the changes, load any data, and then release the new app into the live or into production. And then we'll operate. So operate is about monitoring, backup and restore, tracking compliance. And then the critical last phase there, which is called train and feedback. And that feedback is where we then capture the feedback from end users, which then turns into the requirements, and we start the cycle again. So the trick here is about making sure we drive the cycle so we drive up high adoption. So what we're building is what the end users really want and need, not what they thought they wanted. And sometimes those are different. The second thing is to drive around the cycle as fast as possible to make sure that the business has agility. The fact that we can be responsive from an admin or from a developer perspective to say that the software changes that the business require, we can get them into production as quickly as possible. But the last point is with trust, which means that we're not breaking the org, that those changes aren't causing a problem, and therefore we either have to recall the release or that we have downtime as we try and fix the problems. So when I think about analysis 1.0, how analysis is often done inside organizations is that people are just admins or just developers. And what I mean by that is that someone says, could you just add a pick list, or could you just add a report, or could you just add a field? And we're keen to please, and we go and build those. So a requirement comes in, we haven't really validated it, we go straight into configure and code, and then straight into release. So clearly we're building very quickly, but that could often result in poor adoption. The idea of, I just need a pick list, well, surely there's more implied than that. If you want a new pick list item, do you need another record type, or do you need another report associated with it? So I'm calling this analysis 1.0. We have, I know, feedback, a statement of work, maybe some suggestions, random wishes, and a few gems that get pushed into us as requirements. And there may only be 10 or 15% of those ideas that are genuinely business requirements. And if we don't do any validation and we just start building those, then we end up with the problems I talked about in terms of adoption. So I'm thinking about analysis 2.0, where actually the analysis phase involves requirements, process mapping, some org analysis, and then a user story. So that user story is pivotal. What we're capturing as business requirements at the front end need to turn into technical requirements as a user story. And that user story is what gets passed to our development teams to configure or code. So taking that view of analysis 2.0, between the feedback, statement of work, suggestions, random wishes, which I'm considering our raw requirements, we then need to validate them. And the way we validate them is by mapping processes and looking at the data model. On the back of that, we can then generate what we call our final requirements. And that enables us to write our user stories, but it also enables us to analyze the impact on our org. So we then have a user story with a risk analysis associated with that. And I think the challenge for many organizations is that they don't spend enough time on this phase. There's a pressure to start building. And you need to resist that pressure to say, until we have a very clear understanding about exactly what we need to build, we shouldn't start coding. Analysis becomes before build. Just look in the dictionary. We have to do this piece of work, and we have to be clear that we have very crisp user stories. We have really understood what the end users need in terms of the changes to the org, the changes to the business process, but also the implications in terms of regulatory compliance before we start building. So to validate requirements, we need to map out business processes. So the end users really understand and are crisp about what their requirements are. They understand what the implications are on their business operation. So here is a process diagram. It's been mapped out using a notation called UPN, the Universal Process Notation. And that notation has been around for about 20 years. For those of you who've used to doing flowcharting, think of this as an upgrade to flowcharting. It contains just the same information as flowcharts, but the diagrams are far more compact. And there are a couple of things you can see here from this diagram. First of all, we're trying to keep it to about 8 or 10 boxes on a screen because we want to make sure that this is easy to understand. The confused mind often says no. So 100 boxes, 50 boxes on a screen, and you just blank over. So 10 boxes on a screen. The next thing is every activity box starts with a verb: request, support, resolve, test. So there's an action associated with every activity. And then you'll notice that every box has lines between them, and the lines have text on them. The lines are critically important because it shows the handoff. So we resolve a technical support request, resolved goes out to confirm with the customer. So we need a clear understanding about what resolved means and need agreement from the end users on that. So therefore those lines and the text are critically important. And you can see here that people go, where are the diamonds? I need some decisions. Well, you can see here there's a decision made. Resolve technical support request. It's either resolved or it's not resolved, and therefore it results in a new issue. So that implied in that activity box is a decision. If I need to know more detail, then the notation is hierarchical. So you can have lower level diagrams. So anything with a corner on says there's a lower level diagram. And you can also see a paperclip where you can attach supporting information. So these diagrams are a really great way of working with the end users in live workshops to drive out an understanding about their requirements. But there are actually multiple audiences for these diagrams. Obviously, there's the end users in the design phase, but those process diagrams can also get deployed as the training material so the end users understand how to use the application. Clearly, the developers will need these to provide context alongside the user stories so they understand how to build it or configure the application. They're also used by management. So managers are looking at these process diagrams to understand what metrics they should be measuring. Often it's easy to create metrics which are easily measured rather than the ones which drive the correct behavior. If you understand the process, you can understand what the right metrics are to measure. And finally, if you're in a highly regulated industry, then those process diagrams are the ones that you can use to demonstrate to the auditors that you're following due process. So these process maps are really valuable, and they're not something which you create then throw away at the end of this analysis phase. These live throughout the course of the project, and actually they go round that cycle, and they are essentially the living operations manual for the company. The second thing we need to do is we need to consider the data model. So entity relationship diagrams, ERDs, or data models are really important because they start to give, again, a different perspective on exactly how you would configure the application. So here is here is a data model. I play bass in a band, and we built a little application in Salesforce to manage the band. And you can see we have, at the center, we have gigs, we have venues where we are booked, we have bands who we play alongside, we have a set list. And we assume that booking managers work for venues, but then we discover that booking managers work across multiple venues, and therefore we need to understand which booking managers booked us for which gigs. So it wasn't until we started to understand the data model, we realized that booking manager wasn't a field on the venue, but it was a completely separate object. And again, these decisions need to be made here. Pulling that new object out once we'd already built the application would be quite a big change. So therefore, getting the architecture right when we start building applications means that we need to do the analysis, and part of that analysis is building the data model correctly. And there's a great Trailhead trail that helps you understand how to do data modeling. So if we've validated our requirements, so we've got both the data model and the process maps documented, we can then start identifying which requirements are the ones that support the change in business process. So therefore we can start to group those requirements together, so we can validate them, and then we can triage or prioritize them. The other thing will happen as we go through this process is we will identify new requirements which the end users hadn't thought of. So we've now got a set of user requirements. We're ready to go and build a user story. So user stories have a standard format across the industry. As a ... sales user, I want to ... add an opportunity that's not in US dollars so that I can sell to non-US customers. So these user stories are then passed to the development team, maybe in Agile Accelerator, maybe they're passed across into Jira or into a DevOps tool like Capado, and the new DevOps Center that's being released by Salesforce, they have a work item which is essentially the user story. So this is the universal format for transferring the technical requirement across to the development team. And again, if you're not using user stories, then I would encourage you to start thinking about how you do that, because requirements are the business requirements. They need to be validated and then turn into user stories, which are the technical requirements. But I want to add one extra thing to a user story. I want to add a risk level to a user story. And the reason I want to do that is that I want to be able to identify the overall risk of a release. And if we can categorize our releases into different risk levels, then we can actually do different levels of development and therefore accelerate our development cycle. So if we think about our development process, we probably have developed in a sandbox, we test in our IT integration sandbox, then deploy to production. But not every change needs to go through this high risk, high cost approach. If we understand that a release is medium level risk, then maybe we only develop in the sandbox and deploy straight to production. We don't need to go through our test or IT integration sandbox. If we can identify low risk changes, low risk releases, then maybe we can develop those straight into production. And I know people are holding their hands up in the air and go, but Ian, all Confessions talks about not developing into production. But if you know it is a low risk release because you've done the risk analysis on the metadata items, the user stories, and therefore the release, and you know you can deploy to production, then that means you can deliver it way more quickly, but you need to be able to deliver it with an understanding that actually that release is not going to fail, which means you need to do great analysis on the risk of those releases. And again, that's something I'm going to cover in another topic. But the point about this is you need your user stories to be passed to your development team so they can make sensible decisions about how they are going to develop them in the most cost-effective way possible. So I'd like to bring this to life by showing you a quick example of how we might capture requirements and maps and processes. And I want to do this by using an example of some process maps we drew for work.com. So here we have the top level set of processes for work.com. For those of you who remember, work.com launched on the 1st of June, and we went and built out the process maps that support many of the applications that sit behind work.com. So maybe there are the process diagrams that are lower level around getting people back into work. There's some more process diagrams there associated with sending out the wellness survey. The one I want to focus on here is visitor management, and that's driven off the Traction guest application. So if I click down there, it will take me down to the next level diagram, which is all around how we manage guests. So you can see here, we invite a guest, we pre-register a guest, and there's a question about whether we send them a wellness survey. Once their prerequisites are complete and they arrive on site, we can check them in on site. You can see there's a lower level diagram there, and that probably takes us down to the diagram that says, yeah, enter the building, check out the guest status correct, register the guest data at the front desk, and issue the guest badge. And you can see there's an issue here, which is, have they got their ID from the standard list? If they haven't got the correct ID or they haven't created their wellness survey, then there's a whole process there for how we resolve that. And if it's acceptable, we go back there, or if we've got an issue in terms of a security issue, there's a process step there. So you can see there, we've got a simple process diagram about how you check somebody in, supporting the Traction guest application. So let's just go into edit mode. So this is the signed off version. So let's just go into the draft version, which means I can edit it. So now you can also see that it's linked to which items in metadata items. In this case, the guest event object is connected to this activity here. So if I go across to our central list of requirements, this happens to be an Elements, but it could be an Excel spreadsheet. You can have a custom object inside Salesforce. It doesn't really matter what you're using for capturing the requirements. But the important point is that those requirements are held in one place. So you can manage them through a set of stages, a set of statuses, and that you've got some way of triaging, prioritizing them. And you can see here, I've got 4 requirements. One at the high level just says, we need an app or something like that for contact tracing for guests. We need an acceptable list of forms of ID. Can we enforce wellness checks on guests ahead of time? So again, we can see here we have requirements of very different levels of detail. Can we add a field for ID presented? This is typically what will happen. You'll end up with a set of requirements being dumped in by end users, and then you can work your way through this to identify which of these are requirements that you want to address in a particular release. And the way to do that is have a look at this, this process here. And if we think about the whole idea of pre-registering a guest, let's look and see which requirements are relevant to pre-registering a guest. And can we enforce wellness checks? Well, there's a requirement there with the people have asked, we want to enforce wellness checks on guests ahead of time. and maybe we actually need some acceptable forms of ID, including have they completed their wellness check. So there are a couple of requirements I've just gone and added to this process step, but actually at the same time, when thinking about it, there is a new requirement, which is we need to capture the data privacy consent for the wellness check, something which maybe the end user hadn't considered. Why is this required? What is required? We need sign off via app and capture privacy consent. So that's a new requirement that we've identified when we start thinking about how we pre-register the guest. Now, I could right mouse click, drill down new, and we could start documenting the different steps to get from invite accepted all the way through to prerequisites completed. And again, drawing these boxes and lines in live workshops should be straightforward. This is the best way of engaging the end users rather than trying to take notes, write interview notes. So a guest has accepted an invite. What's the first thing you do is we need to send out wellness check link. That's sent. We need to confirm with guest host. And then we need to decide how we might do that. So part of the UPN approach is the idea of a resource. So maybe we're going to use work.com to send out that wellness form. And we're also going to use the Traction application to confirm with the guest host that we sent those forms out. So you can see a very simple approach of mapping out those processes. We can then add that requirement about sending out the wellness check. So can we enforce the wellness check? And we also need this idea of capturing data privacy consent for the wellness check. So now associated with this process step, we have those two requirements. So what's happening now is we're building some traceability associated with a series of those requirements, which we can then turn into user stories. If I now go back to my requirements, you can start to see that there's that data privacy consent. And from there, I can now start to build some user stories. So I need to go and add a user story. No. So a consent from guest for data privacy. And we can, as you can see, affected roles, acceptance criteria, and then maybe we can start to target a release. So now we're starting to capture those user stories associated with that particular requirement. And that requirement may have one or many user stories. So we may also want to track consents completed. And we may want to automatically expire consents based on data privacy policies. So now you can start to see that that requirement has generated a number of user stories. And it's those user stories that will get synchronized with, say, Jira, Agile Accelerator, or Capado, whatever you're using for managing inside your development cycle. So that's the process side and thinking about user requirements and user stories. The other thing we talked about was the data model. And again, data modeling has a very standard set of formats in terms of how the links, the meanings of these different links. And again, you'll find that if you go through the any data modeling training. But again, identifying that those data models is critically important to understand the implications on how you're going to build the application. And again, it doesn't matter what you build it in, but it's important that you've actually built out this data model so you understand what the relationships are between the different objects. Now, I know that there is the schema builder inside Salesforce, but often that becomes quite overwhelming. So sometimes you just need to build out just the objects that you're worried about in one diagram, so you can so it's easy to see what the relationships are. So in this short session, I've taken you through what I think the key aspects of the analyze phase are before we start building. That's all about capturing requirements, whether it's from feedback from end users, whether it's through business initiatives, capturing those requirements in one place, and then using process maps and data models to triage those requirements and make sure that we have the correct validated requirements. We haven't looked at org impact analysis in any great detail, apart from starting to think about the risk assessment of any particular release based on the metadata changes that are going into it. But the last piece we looked at was how we start to develop user stories and then pass those across to the build phase. So the key takeaways from this session, which is, first of all, you need to understand that implementation lifecycle. Every step in that cycle you need to go through, even if it's a very small change, and it may only take a few minutes to go through each step, but every step, every change goes through every step in that implementation lifecycle. Secondly, you need to formalize your feedback and requirements capture. And finally, and I think this is the most important, you cannot start building until you have a really clear understanding about your user stories. That will, if you do, then it will cost you a lot more in the long run. And I think if anything comes out of this session, it's you building up the evidence or the confidence to push back when you're being forced to start building quickly. And you need the confidence to go, no, we need to do proper analysis. Trust me, in the long term, it will be faster. We'll get better adoption if we get a better understanding. So a couple of resources there. There is a success community for business analysts. There's some training that we've developed at train.elements.cloud/BA. And I said there's a data modeling module on Trailhead, which I encourage you to go and do. So thank you for your time. Please send me emails or hit me on Twitter if you have any questions. So that is Ian@elements.cloud, or on Twitter it's @IanGotts.